Hill, and I'm a biologist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center. I'm calling in from my home office. Prior to introducing our guest speaker, I would like to highlight that the National Conservation Training Center is located on the ancestral lands of many Native people. Due to the painful history of forceful removal, we could not find a full account of Indigenous peoples who occupied the land which was taken from them. We are aware that several Indigenous peoples cared for the lands or traversed the area. These include, but are not limited to, the Iroquois, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. However, it's the Massawamak Nation that was the most prominent of the people in this area. As we've learned more about the Indigenous peoples who had and continue to have relationships with these lands, we better appreciate the soil on which we work, live, and learn. We encourage others to learn more about the land on which they work and reside. At any time during the presentation, should you have questions, please enter them into the chat or email them to broadcast@fws.gov. We will do our best to get to your questions during our Q&A at the end of the presentation. Today, we are going to learn about treaties from Kevin Gover. Kevin Gover is a citizen of the Pawnee Tribe of Oklahoma. He received his bachelor's degree in public and international affairs from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University in 1978. Kevin then earned his Juris Doctor degree from University of New Mexico College of Law in 1981. Following law school, Kevin established a small Native American-owned law firm that specialized in federal Indian law. Gover, Stetson, Williams, and West, PC, grew into the largest Indian-owned law firm in the country and represented tribes and tribal agencies in a dozen states. In 1997, President Clinton nominated Kevin to serve as the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs in the U.S. Department of the Interior. As the senior executive of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, he won praise for his efforts to rebuild long-neglected Indian schools and expand tribal and BIA police forces throughout the country. In 2003, he joined the faculty at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University and served on the faculty of the university's Indian Legal Program, one of the largest such programs in the country. Kevin was director of the National Museum of American Indian from 2007 to 2021. He became Undersecretary for Museums and Culture in 2021. Kevin, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We're really excited that you're here, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer. And good afternoon or to everyone out there. It's good to be here with you. I'm going to, I hope I don't slip into full law professor mode this afternoon. I could talk about treaties for several hours, but I promise you I will not do that. I'm going to give you a brief overview. I suspect many of you are quite familiar with treaties and their impact on your work. Nevertheless, this will be pretty much a primer on treaties between the United States and the Indian nations. So on my first slide, you see a timeline of federal Indian policy. Describing the different phases of federal Indian policy. Keep in mind that these dates are flexible. You know, they weren't hard stops and starts, but rather sort of transitions that took place over time. And of course, from the point of contact until the enactment of the Constitution of the United States, the Indian tribes were really quite independent of both of each other, of the colonies and then of the states. After the Constitution was enacted in 1787 and through, say, the mid-1820s, there was a phase of treaty negotiation where really it was a matter of two independent parties, the United States and a particular tribal nation, really engaging in careful diplomacy, negotiating their interest, and tailoring their relationship. It was marked by two primary things. One is tribal agency, that is, the authority of the tribe to speak on behalf of its citizens. And the second was consent, that in the absence of tribal consent, there was no treaty, there was no action, there was no policy of the United States. Subsequent to that, though, we entered a phase where the United States was really in position to dictate the terms of the engagement between the Indian tribes and the United States. And we call that period a period of relocation. During this time, the United States undertook the extraordinary effort to remove all of the Indian people from the East Coast through the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, and move them all west of the Mississippi. That was the ambition. And it largely succeeded. It was quite an extraordinary thing. Later on, as the westward expansion continued through 1887, more and more tribes were removed from their Aboriginal homelands and confined to reservations. Many of these reservations representing a part of the Aboriginal homelands of the tribes, but of course, not the whole of them. Now, much of this was done by treaty, that is, by a formal document. At some point very early on, the United States determined that it could not simply refuse to acknowledge the presence and the ownership of the tribes, and set up a very legalistic system for relieving them of their title to the lands that they held. And that's an interesting choice because the Spanish, for example, did not do that in Central and South America, but the English and subsequently the United States did. And so these transactions are highly documented and well understood. As I say, the negotiating power between the two parties had thoroughly changed by 1828, and the United States was really in the business of dictating the terms. Nevertheless, they chose to use the form of treaties and later agreements with the tribes to implement their policy. In 1871, the United States abandoned the policy of treaty making with the tribes. It had been unquestioned up to that point from the moment the Constitution was enacted until 1871. The belief being that because Indian tribes were separate entities and not a part of the United States, that they should be dealt with by treaty the same way you would a foreign power. In 1871, though, Congress decided that from that point on, they would no longer conduct their relationship with the tribes by treaty. And this was the historians differ on exactly why that is. The likely story is that the House of Representatives for many years had complained about the commitments that the president in negotiating the treaty and the Senate in ratifying a treaty was making on behalf of the United States. And the House of Representatives, as you may know, under the Constitution, has to initiate all spending bills, and they felt they really needed a part in the approval of these agreements with the tribes. So from 1871 forward, there still were a great many agreements entered into that were ratified by Congress. And I'll get back to that in a moment. So, but beginning in 1887, the tribes were largely confined to reservations. And the United States began to ponder, well, what do we do now? We have these people, we've deprived them of their livelihood. They're no longer able to support themselves in the way they traditionally have. And so they were falling into poverty and indeed into starvation. The United States was providing goods, services, supplies, food to the tribes, but it was very expensive, as you might imagine. And so they began to talk about, well, what do we do about this Indian problem? And the decision that they came to was that they would attempt to assimilate tribal people into the general body politic of the United States. And they did that through a series of policies we refer to as allotment and assimilation. So allotment was a pretty straightforward proposition. It required that each individual Indian family receive an allotment from the tribal reservation, receive a certain amount of land, sometimes 40 acres, sometimes 160, sometimes 320. But and that land then was to be held in trust by the United States for the benefit of that Indian allottee. The remainder of the land on the reservation then was to be open to non-Indian settlement. And it shouldn't surprise you at all to learn that roughly 2/3 of the reservation lands that existed prior to allotment entered non-Indian ownership in the period between 1887 and 1934. At the same time, the government was carrying out a program of assimilation, and that had a couple of very important components to it. One was the infamous Indian boarding schools, where Indian children were taken from their homes and sent to remote locations away from their families, and were basically being trained to not be Indians any longer. I don't know how else to put it. Their hair was cut. They weren't allowed to speak their languages. They weren't allowed to practice their traditional religions. They weren't taught anything that was relevant to their life as a Native person. And you can imagine the trauma of that sort of experience for these kids. And there were roughly 200 boarding schools at the peak of the movement to do that, and they were unabashed that their objective was to de-Indianize these young people and make sure that they no longer thought of themselves as Indians. Another part of the assimilation policy was that tribal governments were basically disbanded. The United States would no longer acknowledge the authority of tribal leadership, at least traditional tribal leadership, and instead, Indian agents of the Bureau of Indian Affairs were the single most powerful government authority on these reservations, and they governed every aspect of Indian life. Indians during this period were the most documented people on earth because the Indian agents would keep devastatingly thorough notes talking about their engagement with individual Indians. You had to have a pass from the superintendent to leave the reservation, to spend any of your own money, to earn any of your own money. And so traditional tribal governance was outlawed. Along with ceremonies, the Indian agents were responsible for ensuring that Indians no longer practiced their religions or gathered, even in social settings, to practice their culture in the traditional way. So this was probably the nadir. During this period, the Indian population hit its absolute lowest point of about 250,000 around 1900. The next policy era is really known as Indian Reorganization. And what happened, a number of things led to the change in policy, but the main reason it changed is because it failed. The allotment and assimilation policy utterly failed to empower Indians economically, socially, politically, or in any other way. And with the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, a more tolerant or progressive outlook was adopted. And the thought became, well, we should really reorganize the tribes and allow them to govern themselves, at least to a certain extent. A great deal of money was poured into Indian country, and Indians also benefited from a number of the New Deal programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration. Many tribes adopted constitutions under a law known as the Indian Reorganization Act. And so again, we see sort of a move back toward the empowerment of the tribe and away from this effort to assimilate Native people. Now, the Indian reorganization policy, in theory, lasted until the mid-50s, but in fact, it collapsed during World War II. And World War II had an enormous impact on Indian country. First of all, tens of thousands of Native men and women served in the armed forces during the war. And during that time, they served with distinction, and people around them began to understand that Indians were perfectly capable of everything that everybody else was. A great many Native Americans also served in the war industries, and so they left the reservations in large numbers and began to earn money and to participate in the broader economy of the United States. Well, and at the same time, because of the resources required for the war, the appropriations to support the Indian reorganization policies were reduced drastically. And so all of this is happening at the same time, and it really changed the way people were relating to the reservations and supporting themselves either on or off the reservations. Immediately after the war, there was a great deal of concern in the Congress that the federal government had grown too large during the war. And in fact, it had grown rather dramatically during that period. And so once again, they began to think about the Indian problem. And they said, those Indians did pretty good in the war, and they seem perfectly capable of supporting themselves. So why do we need these tribes anymore? And why do we need to carry out all of these obligations that we've undertaken in working on the reservations? And so they adopted a policy known as termination. And termination meant that a tribe's reservation would be sold, the proceeds distributed either to a nonprofit corporation of tribal people or distributed to individual members, most often the latter, that the tribal government would be disbanded, and that Indians would no longer hold the special status that they did when they were citizens of the tribe's reservation. The tribes resisted mightily, but several dozen tribes were in fact terminated. Most of them were very small tribes in California, but several large tribes were terminated as well. The result was that the tribal economy immediately collapsed. A great many tribal citizens ended up on welfare, which at that time was provided largely by county governments, rather than without a lot of support from the United States. And so the counties began to object to the termination policy and didn't want to see it happen. Ultimately, the policy, despite its devastating consequences, was only in effect for really 7 years, from 1953 to 1960. And thereafter, a new policy was developed known as Indian self-determination. And that is the policy era that we're in now. And so, and I'll talk some more about that. So let's go to the next slide, please. So here you see the effects of the policies of the 19th century. As I said, the population had collapsed. Indian land bases had been reduced dramatically. They were poorer than dirt poor. They were absolutely destitute. They had the lowest life expectancy in the country. Unemployment, even as late as 1990, exceeded 70%. And but yet there are over 200 reservations in 27 states. and almost half of those actually in California. Next slide, please. Now, this slide has 4 maps showing the extent of the Indian land base at various points in history. As you can see, in 1850, roughly half the country was still in Indian hands. By 1865, that had decreased dramatically. By 1880, we're beginning to see only enclaves of Indian land. And then in 1990, we see the dots on the map that represent Indian country. The largest reservation, of course, in the country is the Navajo Reservation at the Four Corners region of the Southwest. Next slide. So as I said, the way it all started was as treaties between equals. There are references to Indian tribes in the Constitution, in the Commerce Clause, where Congress is given the authority to regulate commerce among the several states with foreign nations and with Indian tribes. To pursue that authority or an exercise of that authority, they enacted what we call the Trade and Intercourse Acts, which prohibited any private transactions with the tribes. Only the United States could enter into agreements regarding Indian land with the tribes. If there could be another transaction, for example, if a state chose to make an agreement, but it was invalid without federal approval. And so in the 1970s and 80s, you may recall there were a number of very dramatic Indian land claims, mostly in New England and in the eastern United States. And that's because those states had made treaties with the tribe but had never gained federal approval of them. And they resulted in rather dramatic settlements that reestablished an Indian land base. Next slide, please. The way the courts look at these treaties, which remain in effect for these reasons, even though at various points the United States was dictating the terms of the agreements, they remain in effect. And because the United States was the most powerful party, the courts adopted certain rules. First, that treaties are to be interpreted as the Indians would have understood them, not because the treaties were in English and they were written by the United States. And so that language should be interpreted as broadly as possible in favor of the Indians. And finally, and most importantly, the courts say that treaties are grants of rights from Indians and not grants of rights to them. And so that means that Indians retain all rights they had that they did not expressly grant away in the treaties. Next slide. Let's go on to the next slide. So during the relocation and reservation period, the Western migration of non-Indians actually managed to outpace the removal policy, so that tribes that had been removed from east of the Mississippi to places like Kansas soon found themselves pressed upon by non-Indian settlers moving into that territory. And some tribes, say the Potawatomi, the Sac and Fox, Kickapoos, found themselves being moved over and over. Finally, many of them landing in Oklahoma, which at one point was thought to be the permanent home for as many tribes as possible, known as Indian Territory, later Indian Territory, and Oklahoma Territory. The discovery of gold in California meant that there would be massive traffic across the Great Plains, and the United States was, in some cases, unable, and in all cases, unwilling to stop the migration of people across Indian lands. As a result, the United States began to negotiate treaties with the tribes to allow safe passage of settlers and 49ers across their land. A good example is the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which created the Great Sioux Reservation. Under that treaty, a right-of-way was granted that was basically the width of a wagon. We've all seen the pictures of the Conestoga wagons, making their way across the plains. It was only a little wider than that. Interestingly enough, those rights-of-ways later came to support the railroads and were interpreted as allowing the railroads to build on those rights-of-way. Next slide. A couple of things I forgot to mention in the discussion of the assimilation period. First, that in 1924, Indians were made citizens of the United States. Now, they did not. It wasn't voluntary. It wasn't as though Indians had to go sign up to be citizens. They were just made citizens, and at least in some tribes, they said, "Well, no, we don't wish to be citizens." Some tribes maintain to this day that they are not citizens, that they've never agreed to citizenship, and so they refuse, for example, to participate in elections. The reason, though, that citizenship was granted was really the performance of Native American soldiers in World War I. Once again, several thousand Native men served in Europe. And those of you who've heard of the Indian code talkers, the first code talkers were actually in World War I. The Marines recruited Navajos for World War II, but it was Choctaws and Chickasaws and Muskogees who were really the code talkers of World War I. Next slide. And the next slide, please. So let's go back to the Indian Reorganization Act. So, as I said, it was an effort by the United States to reestablish tribal government. But there were some other kind of interesting things in it. First, and most importantly, it ended the allotment of Indian land. So the allotment policy was fully abandoned. Second, it created Indian preference in BIA employment. So Indian preference remains the law to this day. And, it took decades, but eventually the overwhelming majority of employees of the Bureau of Indian Affairs are Native. It also established a fund for the repurchase of land for the tribes, and had several provisions that supported economic development in Indian country. Next slide. A couple of other things to mention about the termination and relocation policy. Could we move to the next slide? I'm sorry, go back one. I thought I had another one in there. One other thing that was happening during this period, two other things. One was that jurisdiction over a great many reservations was transferred from the tribe in the United States to the state in which the reservation was located. And we called it Public Law 280. And it had quite a dramatic effect in those states. California is the largest 280 state, and the reservations there are subject to state jurisdiction. So it's the state that provides law enforcement on the reservations. Another program was called Relocation, and what that was a program where the Bureau of Indian Affairs on the reservation would recruit Indians and Indian families and encourage them to move to major cities and to become basically to enter the American mainstream, if you will. And tens of thousands of Native Americans did in fact do that. The idea was that they would be given grants to, sort of get their feet on the ground in their new homes, and eventually find work and become self-supporting, and no longer burdens to the government. That's how we end up with significant Native American populations in places like Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And so, as you may know, most Native American people now are not residents of their reservations, and that was the beginning of that phenomenon. Next slide. So that brings us to the self-determination era. On this slide, you'll see photographs of President Kennedy, President Johnson, and President Nixon. In the 1960 presidential campaign, both Nixon and Kennedy indicated that they would no longer pursue the termination policy if they were elected. And in fact, President Kennedy declared termination a failure in 1962. His successor, President Johnson, was the first president to use the phrase self-determination. And Indians did very well under Johnson's Great Society programs, particularly the one known as the Community Action Program. For the first time, federal money, was being given to tribes for them to use in their discretion, to use in any way that they chose for the benefit of their communities. And this had a dramatic effect in a great many places. We began to see just the first hints of the tribes beginning to recover from the economic devastation of prior policy periods. And then in 1970, the policy became official when President Nixon sent a message to Congress urging that the Congress enact a great many statutes that would support the self-determination of the tribes. He basically rejected the idea that termination was one of two wildly different options. He said that we can both support the tribes without being overbearing in our administration of our responsibilities to the tribes. And so Nixon was by far the most important president of the 20th century for the tribes. Next slide. Here we see pictures of Presidents Carter, Clinton, Senator McCain, Senator Inouye, and I forget who that last guy is. I used to know. But during this period, a number of important reforms took place. In 1974, Congress authorized something called the American Indian Policy Review Commission. It was a commission of a congressional commission that had 11 distinct task forces, and one of them was really about treaties and the federal trust responsibility. And it happened. I was an intern on that task force. In 1977, President Carter established the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. There had long been a Commissioner of Indian Affairs, but Indian Affairs sort of wandered around the Interior Department and never really had a home among the other assistant secretaries. And so finally, by establishing an Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, it really raised the level of advocacy for Native Americans in the Interior Department. At the same time, the Senate revived the Committee on Indian Affairs. For a very long time, it had been in the Interior Committee of the Senate and the House, actually. But the Senate determined that it needed a specific committee to consider mostly all of the recommendations that had been received from the American Policy Review Commission. And then in the 1990s, President Clinton issued a bunch of important executive orders that really, for the first time, brought forward these ideas of consultation, that before a federal agency takes action that might affect a tribal community, the tribe had to be consulted. Similarly, when a federal agency was going to take action that would impact Native American religious freedom, that had to be considered in the decision-making process. Next slide, please. Is that the last slide? No. I also wanted to give you just a few examples of the legislation that took place. Because the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs came into existence, there's been just a huge amount of legislation regarding Native Americans since that time. But even before the committee was established, Congress passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971. What's significant about it, aside from it sort of rejected the idea of tribes being the primary support for those communities, and opting instead for a model of establishing corporations, both at the local level and at the regional level. It acknowledged or allowed the tribes the communities, to select 50 million acres of land to belong to the corporations, and also $1 billion in seed capital. Now, these days, $1 billion doesn't sound like very much, but at the time, that was a lot of money. And so it was really quite a remarkable achievement by Alaska Natives to have their land claims settled in that way. In the 1990s, under Assistant Secretary Ada Deer, the Alaska Native villages were also acknowledged as tribes. So interestingly, Alaska Natives have a dual status, both as shareholders of their village and regional corporations, but also as citizens of their tribes. Next slide. There were a great many pieces of legislation and other activities that took place in the area of cultural resources and religious freedom. As I mentioned, President Nixon was the most significant president of the 20th century for the tribes, and one of the reasons was the restoration of Taos Blue Lake to the ownership of the Taos Pueblo in New Mexico. It met ferocious resistance, the idea of returning this place, which is sacred to the Taos people. But nevertheless, Nixon pressed on, and eventually Congress did, in fact, pass legislation taking the land from the Forest Service and restoring it to the Taos Pueblo. In 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act passed. In 1989, the National Museum of the American Indian Act passed. And I include that as a significant moment because keep in mind how hard the United States was working 100 years earlier to do away with Native American culture and really to try to move past the whole existence of Native Americans on the continent. And then in 1989, Congress passed a law creating this museum on the National Mall, which is both to celebrate the Native American past and, more importantly, the Native American present. In 1990, Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, both protecting Native American graves on all federal lands and requiring museums that receive federal support, which is virtually all museums in the country, who had Native American cultural objects or Native American human remains, to return them to the tribes upon the request of the tribes. That same year, they passed a Native American Languages Act, another interesting twist where, after having worked so hard to kill Native American language, in 1990, the Congress Act to restore them. And then finally, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was really designed to address a specific decision of the court regarding the use of peyote as a sacrament by the tribes, or by certain people within the tribes. Next slide, please. In the area of environment and natural resources, we see acts like the Indian Mineral Development Act of 1982, which for the first time really took the process of leasing tribal land from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and giving it directly to the tribe, and allowing the tribes to operate not just by lease, but perhaps by joint venture or other ways of organizing themselves to develop minerals on their lands. Very significantly, during this period, the federal environmental statutes, several of them at least, were amended to essentially treat tribes the way states are treated under these laws. So Superfund and the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Clean Air Act all have provisions requiring the EPA to treat tribes as states under certain conditions, and completely changed the relationship between the EPA and the tribes. Next slide. So the self-determination era has completely, once again, reversed what had gone before it, whether it be termination or assimilation or relocation. And the federal policy focus is now on respecting tribal sovereignty, at least in the political branches, the legislative and the administrative. Tribal governments and courts are seen as part of the governmental network in the United States. And tribes have done a brilliant job, frankly, of weaving themselves into the service delivery system and the law enforcement system, and the environmental regulatory system, so that states and tribes are now cooperating on these things in a way they never had before. And I believe that leaves us in a situation where tribal governments really are now regarded as permanent components of American governmental and political systems. That there no longer is a debate, and hopefully there never will again be a debate on whether tribes should continue to exist. And if nothing else, that's an enormous accomplishment after the history we've just seen. Is that the last slide? I believe it is. All right. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. That was a hurry through 240 some years of federal Indian policy, but I'm happy to answer any specific questions you might have.
Thank you, Kevin. So we do have a question from the chat. Were any of the terminated tribes able to regain their tribal status?
Yes, thanks for asking that. Yes, many of them have. The most significant are the Klamath and the Menominees. Those were the largest tribes that were terminated, and the Menominees were the first to be restored. It was a few years later that the Klamath were restored. A number of California tribes have also been restored, either by specific legislation in the Congress or, very interestingly, by court action, where the courts found that the Bureau of Indian Affairs never finally pulled the trigger, even though the land was gone, the tribe had been largely disbanded, but the final formalistic things that had to take place never did. So several dozen tribes have been restored. I'm not aware of any tribe that has sought restoration that has not received it.
Okay. Can you provide any examples of ways that tribes resisted removal?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, in every possible way. Sometimes by armed resistance, and other times the Cherokees, for example, pursued remedies in both the federal legislative process and in the federal judicial process, which resulted in some what appeared to be dramatic victories in the Supreme Court in the early 1830s, where the court said that the state of Georgia had no authority on Indian lands, and that when we say treaty and when we talk about Indian nations, we chose those words and we use them in the same way with regard to Indians that we do with regard to any other people. Nevertheless, the Cherokees eventually, by fraud, frankly, and by force, were forced out of their lands in Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. But they resisted in every way they could think of. And when you think about it, we tend to think about these things as having happened very quickly, but usually it took decades, and a number of tribes never were removed. Despite the best efforts of the United States, there are still Cherokees in North Carolina, and there is now a federally recognized Cherokee tribe in North Carolina. So they never left. The same with the Seminoles in Florida, the Choctaws in Mississippi, certain Creek bands in Alabama, and so they resisted.
Good for them. Let's see, there's a question here. What is the next era for tribes, in your opinion?
Great question. It's no longer my job to think too hard about these things, but something I thought about when I was at the law school and studying treaties and studying, sort of this history of federal Indian policy. As I said at the beginning, there were two key components to the idea of treaty making with the tribes. Three, really. One was that it was specific to an individual tribe. It was tailored to the specific circumstances that existed between the tribe and the United States. Two, the tribal government had agency. It had authority. It was understood to be the appropriate authority with whom the United States should deal when dealing with tribal citizens. And third was that element of consent, that without tribal consent, nothing could happen. So what we've seen happening in the last 50 years, really, with the self-determination policy is almost a return to those ideas. First, that it is a negotiated relationship. And these negotiations take many forms. We see, for example, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Indian Health Service, and other agencies at Interior are authorized and in some cases compelled to make agreements with the tribes for the delivery of certain services or the regulation of certain matters. In other cases, and so all of that is negotiated. Even in dealing with Congress now, while Congress was very aggressive in the late 19th and early 20th century in basically just determining for itself what was best for the tribes. It's very rare now that a piece of legislation passes affecting the tribes that the tribes have not agreed to, in essence. So while it's not a perfect negotiation, it's beginning to look a lot like that. Second, the agency of the tribes these days is simply unquestioned. And as I pointed out, at various points in history, the question was raised over and over, do we really need tribes? Do we need this tribal thing to take care of our Native American citizens? And now, the answer is a resounding yes. So here's where I think that the next question becomes. We've been seeing more and more legislation where the agencies are required to consult with tribes about a particular project, about a particular agency, about particular issues around the operation of the agencies in places or on subjects that affect Native American interests. And the question is going to become, do certain things going forward require tribal consent in the same way that the treaties did? And I really think that that's sort of the next phase where we begin to have very important debates about when do we actually need the tribe's approval to do these things. A great example is the Dakota Access Pipeline. Tribal consent was not required by the law in the approval of the Dakota Access Pipeline, but perhaps it should have been. And so I think that's the next discussion that will take place on a large scale in Indian country.
Okay. Here's a comment and a question. The Seneca in New York and Pennsylvania had a treaty signed by George Washington. This treaty was broken to build a flood control reservoir during the early 60s. Are there any insights you can share on that?
Yes. First of all, that's a great example of the absence of consent, right? That the Federal Power Commission was authorized to put these dams pretty much anywhere they pleased. And remember, this is pre-NEPA, there were very few environmental controls on these things. So any place where it sort of made sense to the Federal Power Commission to build a dam and a hydroelectric plant, they were building dams. Well, the Senecas said, hold on now, we have this treaty, and there's nothing in this law that says you can condemn Indian land to do this. And the Supreme Court stunningly said, well, any law of general application that applies elsewhere in the country also applies to Indian land. That was the first time they had ever said that. The rule had always been the opposite, that Congress had to say very specifically, we're abrogating this treaty. But in that case, they were allowed to do it, and it was an outrage. I don't believe that will ever happen again. And under the current legal regime, believe me, I'm no fan of the Supreme Court when it comes to federal Indian law. But I don't believe that Congress or the executive branch would permit that to happen again. But you're right, it was a treaty signed by George Washington himself, negotiated. And we actually have an exhibition about that in the National Museum of the American Indian, and another one in New York, in an exhibition called Native New York.
Great. All right, I think we have time for one question. The question is, do you know are other California tribes currently in the process of seeking restoration?
I know of some tribes that are seeking recognition, but they've never, they were not terminated. They've simply never been acknowledged at all by the United States. There may be a handful that are still litigating, but I'm not aware of any tribe that's seeking legislation to be restored from termination. So I guess my answer is I don't know. I don't know.
Always an acceptable answer.
I use it often.
Well, Kevin, we want to thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. We really appreciate your time. We're going to wrap up today's show. So we want to note that there will be no broadcast for the month of December. Starting in January, NCTC will begin hosting the Indigenous Speaker Series on the third Wednesday of each month. As a reminder, each broadcast is recorded and available on NCTC's website. If you wish to learn more about the broadcast series or to be added to the listserv, please email myself at jennifer_hill@fws.gov. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day.